had a request from some students who weren't able to attend. So we're going to try to get the recording set up. If you do have questions, you can go ahead and put it in the chat box, or we hopefully should have question and answer time at the end of David's formal presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and let David take the, I was going to say take the floor, but I guess it's take the screen. I don't know.
Thanks, Dale. So welcome everybody, and it's a pleasure to be at least virtually back at Seattle University again to present on these topics so important to students. Hopefully next year I'll be back in person. Keep your fingers crossed. We'll see what happens going forward. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, there's a full bio, my full bio at the end of the presentation, and Dale will provide this presentation to everyone who attends, and I don't know if you'll provide it to other folks in the international student population, but everyone will get a copy of the presentation. So don't worry about taking screenshots, don't worry about scribbling notes furiously, those kinds of things, because you will get a copy. And I should mention that the presentation will contain a lot more information that I'm going to give you today in an hour. We're going to try to save at least 15 minutes, depending on how many questions we have in the chat box, at least 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes at the end for questions. So I will get to all your questions. If I do not answer all your questions today, I will answer them by email, and Dale will provide you with the answers. Okay. So a little bit about me. I have been an immigration attorney for 39 years. That's all I've ever done pretty much, except for the first year when I was a lawyer, baby lawyer. I did a few other things, but immigration has been my heartbeat for 38 years pretty much. During that time, our firm has focused on higher ed, that is students, exchange visitors, researchers, professors, and people coming out of higher ed, students going into the private economy. So that's been our primary focus. We do have a lot of other focuses. We do family immigration, we do asylum, we do all sorts of things, but employment-based immigration is a big, big focus for us, and higher ed is another big focus. So let's get started. We're going to talk today about everything that happens after you graduate. All the way from, you know, hey, I just finished my program, to, hey, I'm a permanent resident. I'm going to try to cover as much of permanent residence as I can, but I will probably, if this happens, this presentation goes forward like most of mine do, I'm going to spend 90% of my time on H1Bs and other visa alternatives, because that's what you need to know now, most of you. And I'm going to briefly cover permanent residence at the end. If you have questions for me, if you have a quick question that I can answer very quickly, I will answer by email. If you want to shoot me an email, my email is there on the screen. If your question is complicated, even though you don't perceive it as complicated, for example, how do I become a permanent resident? That's a very complicated question. I will ask you to set up a consultation to go over your situation with our office. Okay, so let's get started. So first of all, let me just warn you that the subject matter I'm going to cover in this presentation is general information. It is not legal advice for your particular situation. If you need legal advice for your situation, you need to consult either our firm or a lawyer, an immigration lawyer of your choice. If you go out there looking for an immigration lawyer, make sure they have expertise in the subject matter area that you're asking about. Immigration lawyers tend to be hyper specialized. That is, some specialize in asylum, some specialize in family immigration, some specialize in employment-based immigration. Our firm, thankfully, covers the waterfront. We do a little bit of everything, or a lot of everything, I should say, but a lot of lawyers do not do that. So if you're going to a lawyer for an asylum case, for example, don't go to one that only does employment-based immigration. Ask about the lawyer's expertise before you set up a meeting with the lawyer. Okay. Very important that you never get advice from friends or relatives. The worst misinformation that I hear third hand is from clients who've gotten advice from their friends or relatives, and often it's too late for me to help them. They've done something based on advice from an uncle, and it's totally messed up their situation. And so please don't ever get advice from friends or relatives. Their case or their friend's case is probably going to be very different from yours, okay? Never consult a non-attorney for immigration advice. Non-attorneys can close up shop, they can take your money, close up shop, and disappear. And you know, you spent $5,000 and it's gone and you can't find it and you can't find the person. Lawyers cannot do that. Lawyers have a license. They can lose their license if they misadvise you or they mishandle some matter that you've entrusted to them. So lawyers usually are pretty trustworthy. Some are not very good. I can't say that. They're all good, but at least they can't escape into the night with your money and, you know, not do anything for you. If anything I say today conflicts with what the international office has told you, please follow their advice. They've known you for usually several years. I will only know you for a few hours today. So please follow their advice if it conflicts with mine. They are experts. Dale and his staff are experts on anything relating to your student status or benefits accruing from your student status. If you have questions about your student status today, I will answer them, but you probably, after this presentation, it's probably a good idea to consult with the international office for their opinion. So the general idea, if you want to stay in the United States, the general steps to stay, there are 5, really simple, very simple. You can, you know, print out this slide and put it up on your bulletin board in your dorm room. Easy peasy. Okay, first of all, complete your degree in a field that's in demand in the US. How do you figure out if a field is in demand? Okay, whether it's hot or it's not. Well, you go to talk to career services early and often. Career services will be able to counsel you on basically what fields are in demand. They'll also be able to help you improve your resume, improve your interviewing skills. So go to talk to career services early and often. Don't wait till your junior year after you're deep into your major to go and talk to them, because it's very sad for me when I encounter people who are about to complete a degree in a field in which they will never get a job in the US. And there are such fields. I won't name them because I don't want to shame anybody on this call, but in any case, there are such fields that just with an undergrad degree, it's virtually impossible to get a job in that field. Don't miss OPT. It's virtually impossible to skip OPT. It's a very bad idea to try to skip OPT, because if you're trying to skip it and you're applying for something else, for example, if you're going straight away to an H1b, what if that H1b is not granted? Then you've missed OPT, you've missed your window for applying, and you can't go back and apply after the 150-day window passes. If you have a STEM zip code, the zip code is the code for your field on your I-20. If your zip code is science, technology, engineering, or math, you may be able to apply for a STEM extension. That will give you a full 3 years of OPT. And that's really important. I'm going to talk a little bit about the H1b lottery in a minute, but getting that 3 years of OPT, if you qualify for it, is super important, because you may miss the lottery the first year. You may miss it the second year. So you really need a bunch of bites at the apple, as we say, to get into the lottery. We've had clients that have tried every year for 3 years and have missed the lottery all 3 years. So very important, if you qualify for STEM, apply for it. Also, just to let you know, and Dale can reiterate this, these days, and this is kind of I think, a Trump halo effect. These days, OPT applications and STEM extensions are denied for the most tiny technicalities. The tiniest thing, if you make the tiniest error in your application, it will be denied and it'll be sent back to you, or the decision will be sent to you after your application period is over. And this is an extremely sad thing, because there's very, very little that Dale or I can do to help you once that happens. So you really, really need to be very, very careful when you apply for OPT. You need to make sure that all your T's are crossed and all your I's are dotted in your application and your STEM OPT application. Next up, number 3, get a good job with a good company. You know that for OPT, you don't have to have a pre-existing job offer. You can go out and look for a job for up to 90 days, okay? So once you find that good job with a good company, and if it's not a household name like Google or Apple or one of those companies, use Dun & Bradstreet, which is a corporate rating service, to find out about the company, to find out the number of employees, how long the company's been in business, whether there are any negative things about the company that you might need to know, and things like that. Also, it's very, very important that when you go to the interview or interviews with the company, that you ask generally about their policies on sponsorship. You have to ask both about their policy for visa sponsorship, that is the H1b. You also need to ask about their permanent resident sponsorship policy. Some companies, particularly the big ones like Microsoft and Google, will make you wait a very long time before they start permanent residence for you. And this can have a very negative effect on your situation, particularly if you're Indian or Chinese. And we'll talk about why Indians and Chinese are negatively affected more than other people in a little while. Okay. Then number 4, and I should go back, and this is kind of career services advice, but the way you corner a good job with a good company, and this has been very difficult during COVID, try to do as many internships as you can during your program. Internships, you can get authorization to work in internships via curricular practical training. Dale's office can authorize that for you. If you get an internship and the company likes you, they will hire you. They'll make you an offer after graduation. So that would be a very, very strong piece of advice in getting a good job offer, is do an internship if you possibly can. Even if the internship is unpaid, you will still need to get CPT authorization. And even if it's unpaid, do it, because you'll give the company some exposure to you. They'll know your work habits, know what you're like, and it vastly increases the chances you're going to get a job offer after you graduate. Okay, number 4, get a work visa. In 90% of the cases of folks on this call, this is going to be an H1b visa. The H1b has a lot of drawbacks, unfortunately, but it's probably the only choice for most of you. And we'll talk about the H1b in just a sec, and we'll also talk about alternatives to the H1b. The registration process for the H1b is going to start in just about 10 days on March 9th. So if you're trying for an H1b this year or next year, make sure your employer gets your name into the registration process on a timely basis. And finally, once you get on with the company and show them what a hard worker you are and what an overachiever you are, they will offer you sponsorship for the green card. And that's your final step. When you get the green card, you're done. You're allowed to work for any company, anywhere in the US. You're not restricted to the company that sponsored you. Okay, so let's move on and talk a little bit more in detail about the H1b visa. So as I said before, this is the visa that 90% of you will end up getting in the workplace. There are a few alternatives that apply to certain nationalities and certain special situations, but the H1b is what you want. This is for persons working in what we call specialty occupations. And we'll tell you what a specialty occupation is in just a sec. If you want to know, and this is important again, going into the interview, going into the job interview, figuring out what companies sponsor for the H1b. If you want to know who they are, you can go to this website. This is one of many private websites where you can get this information. The information is provided by the US Department of Labor. It's public information. And it will tell you where folks are sponsoring, what occupations they're sponsoring for, what companies are sponsoring, how many H1Bs they filed recently in the past several years, what they're paying their workers, and so on and so on. There are a lot of data points that you can sort by. So it's fun, even if you're not going to have, even if you're not going to need an H1B for 2 or 3 years, just to go to this database and fiddle around with it, look at it. Okay. So specialty occupation, let's go back to that. So it's a very, very precise definition in order to qualify you for the H1B. It's very precise. It's not vague, very precise. So I call it the three-legged stool. We all know that basic physics dictates that if you have a three-legged stool and one of the legs is missing, the stool immediately falls down. Okay, so what are the three legs? One, you have at least a 4-year degree. This can be a US degree, or it can be a degree from abroad. It can be a higher level degree, a master's or a PhD, but at least at bottom, a bachelor's degree, 4-year bachelor's degree in a particular field. The job that you're being offered by the H-1B employer requires the same or very similar degree. And by requires, I don't mean that the employer says that the job requires this degree. I mean that the industry standard is that the degree is required for the job. Let me give you one very simple example. You get a BS degree in accounting. The employer offers you a position as an accountant. The job requires a BS degree in accounting, okay? Very, very simple. You have the degree, the job you're being offered, the industry standard requirement is that the degree is required for that job, your particular degree, okay? Sometimes in some occupations, it's a little bit more flexible. For example, if you're going into IT, information technology, sometimes there are a few more degrees than just a computer science degree that are acceptable by immigration, other than computer science, such as engineering or management information systems, things like that. But generally, immigration wants to see just 1 or 2 degree fields that qualify you for the position based on industry standards. Okay, and third, the employer is willing to pay you what we call the required wage, and is also willing to pay the filing and attorney's fees. Okay, if the employer is unwilling to pay you that minimum wage, I'm not talking $7.25 an hour or even $15 an hour a year. I'm talking what the Labor Department requires you to be paid in order to avoid harming US workers. And if the employer is unwilling to pay the filing and or attorney's fees, you're not going to get the H-1B. The employer is required by law to pay you that wage and pay all the fees involved with the process. All the fees, as we say, to get you on board, to get you onto the payroll. Any of these three is missing, you won't get the H-1B. And I just had a contact the other day from a young lady who said her employer wanted her to pay all the fees for the H-1B. And I said, well, that's just not possible. You need to go back to your employer and say, this is not possible. Here's a fact sheet to explain why. Okay, what are the other H-1B musts? What must you also have for the H-1B? Well, you're limited to the employer or employers who petition for you. Okay, you can have more than one H-1B at the same time. Each of those H-1Bs can be part-time if need be. Your employment on H-1B is generally limited to 6 years with all employers, unless some employer begins employment-based permanent residence for you before the end of your 5th year of H-1B. Your employment on the H-1B has to be directly related to a degree that you have. It doesn't necessarily have to be directly related to your last degree program. For example, if you have an engineering degree from your home country and you're in the US getting an MBA, the H-1B employment offer could be related either to the engineering degree or the MBA. Not a problem. H-1Bs are allowed to have what we call dual intent. This is a very, very valuable benefit, which allows you to pursue permanent residence while you maintain your H-1B status and while you get reentry to the US, new visas abroad, H-1B status extensions in the US. None of those things is impeded in any way by your pursuing permanent residence. Now, if you did that as an F or a J, you wouldn't be possible. Fs and Js are not allowed to have dual intent. They have the sole intent to maintain a residence abroad that they have no intention of abandoning. So dual intent is a super valuable thing to have. And H-1Bs and Ls, transfer visas, are the only visa types in our system where that dual intent is enshrined in the immigration law. Okay, a fairly new thing. This is from January of 2017. There is a 60-day grace period possible between H-1B jobs. So say you suddenly lose your job with one employer, you have up to 60 days to have the new employer file a new H-1B petition for you. And finally, I should say that a limited number of H1Bs, and we call this a quota, means that there's a lottery each year for these visas. And that's probably the biggest drawback to the H1B classification is this lottery. Some employers really have stopped doing new H1Bs because of the lottery, because many employees, unless they have a U.S. earned bachelor's or U.S. earned master's degree, have a fairly low chance of succeeding in the lottery. So some employers have just quit the H1B lottery altogether. But luckily, those employers are in the minority because certain fields are still in very, very high demand in the U.S., and employers cannot find U.S. workers to fill all their openings, particularly STEM fields. STEM in almost every area continues to be hot, particularly IT. The unemployment rate in IT is probably less than 0.0001% in Seattle. Okay. So what are the employer's obligations in the H-1B process? Well, first of all, there can't be any fraud in the process. Fraud is basically lying to the government. So the employer has to truthfully state the job requirements, where the person's going to be working, what they're going to be paid, and what they're going to be doing. If any of those things is misstated in the application, that can be imputed to you. That can be cast back to you, and you can get in big trouble. So you need to make sure that the employer is straight up in the paperwork and that nothing is false in the paperwork. Next up, there has to be a rational relationship between the size and the nature of the business and the job offered. So when I worked on the Texas Service Center, the Immigration Texas Service Center Liaison Committee for our professional organization of lawyers, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, we would go to the Service Center frequently and meet with the officials there. And we'd meet in an inside conference room, right, that everybody had access to. And in that conference room, there was what they called the laugh board, this big bulletin board that had examples of laughable filings from employers and foreign nationals that just made their employees laugh, okay? And basically, you know, if your employer files a petition, an H-1B petition for you, saying, for example, let's go back to the accountant example, saying that you're going to be a full-time accountant for a convenience store, immigration is going to put that on the laugh board. Why? Because a convenience store that might have 4 or 5 employees does not need a full-time accountant. That's going to be on the laugh board. So when I say there has to be a rational relationship between the size, the nature of the business, and the job offered, immigration is going to look at what you're being asked to do, what you're going to be doing in your job, how big the business is, and whether normally in the, you know, normal world, a business of that type and that size would need someone with your expertise. Okay, so this cuts out the ability of the employer to just say, okay, you know, you're my friend, I'm going to sponsor you as an accountant for my convenience store. That cuts out that whole dynamic because it just won't happen. It'll go on the laugh board and the petition will immediately be denied. So make sure that if you're being offered a job, it's a real job, real employment, real full-time work. You're actually going to be doing what the employer says you're going to be doing. Next up, they have to agree to employ the H-1B worker only in the geographic location set out in the petition packet or the labor condition application. So for example, if they say you're going to be working in Houston, Texas, they can't suddenly transfer you to New York City. Okay, you've got to stay in Houston. If they want to transfer you to New York City, it's not a problem. They just have to file more paperwork with immigration. And as I mentioned before, they have to agree to pay you the required wage. This is a Labor Department required wage. And we're going to talk about the required wage in detail right now. So what is the required wage, the employer's wage obligation? Well, they have to agree to pay you the higher of the actual or prevailing wage. The actual wage is an average of wages paid to other similarly employed, similarly qualified workers at the same work site. The prevailing wage is a weighted mean or median wages for similar positions in the geographic area of employment. That is, the area within commuting distance of a particular job, usually about 100 miles. So basically this means it has to be a competitive wage, both for the work site and for the area of employment. If you want to see what the minimum wage would be for a job that you're interested in, these wages are sorted by county and state. You can go to this URL here, and the level 1 wage is probably what the minimum you're going to have to be paid. But note that on July 1st, the Department of Labor is going to raise these wage levels. So the wage you look at now will not be the same one you see on July 1st. So you might want to wait, if you're going to be graduating, let's say next year, wait and look at the wages after July 1st, and that'll tell you what the wages will be. So the area of intended employment and the work site are obviously different. I like to think of them as big circle, small circle. The work site is where you actually would be working. And the prevailing wage is the area within commuting distance. Okay, so work site is small circle, prevailing wage is big circle. The employer has to pay you the higher of those two figures. Okay, so whichever the higher one is, that's what they have to pay. If you go to that URL that I gave you 2 slides ago, the FLC Data Center, you will see something like this, okay? This is for computer programmers in the San Francisco area. And basically, you want to look at these wages. Level 1 is the minimum that the Department of Labor will require that the employer pay you as an H1B worker, okay? So as I said, these are sorted by county and state, or parish and state if you're in Louisiana. And you can find any occupation in any county, any state. Okay, very, very easy database to use. If you're going to work for higher ed and certain other related institutions, you're going to want to click at the top when you start this search on the higher ed database. If you're going into private industry or private employers, you want to do the all industries database as shown here. Okay, more employer obligations. So the employer, if you're terminated with the employer, or you're let go involuntarily for any reason, you're laid off, you're terminated, whatever it might be, you're separated involuntarily, before the end of the H1B petition period, they have to offer you return transportation to your country of nationality. Now, in my 39 years of experience, I have very rarely seen people take the return transportation offer. They don't have to offer you cash, they just have to offer you a plane ticket. Very rare, because most people get another job pretty quickly if they're laid off or they lose their job. The employer also has to notify other workers of the terms of the job, including the salary. This goes up in the form of 2 10-day postings at the work site or a letter to the union if the position is unionized. And the employer has to pay the attorney's fees and has to pay all filing fees, that is, fees to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And what are those fees? Well, the regular filing fee, or the basic filing fee, is $460 for the H1B petition. There's also something required called an anti-fraud fee. There's also something for most employers called an acquia fee. The acquia fee is $1,500 if the employer has 26 or more full-time employees, or $750 if the employer has fewer than 26 full-time employees. There's a filing fee for dependents, $370. All dependents are comprised within the same filing fee. There's a filing fee if you want very fast processing, 15-day processing. It's called a premium processing fee, and that's $2,500. And finally, you have attorney's fees. Those vary very, very widely. I think you can find kind of self-help programs on the internet where they charge you $299 to have you prepare your own H1B petition and have an attorney supposedly review it. That's crazy. Do not do that. That's very high risk. You also have law firms that can charge you up to $10,000 for an H1B. I wouldn't go there either. If you're charged with the responsibility of finding an attorney to handle the H1B process, I would try to land somewhere in the middle. Get a price quote from each attorney that you consult with and try to land somewhere in the middle. Don't go for the very, very high priced or the cheap attorneys. and you'll get usually pretty good service. But make sure you ask the attorney what their expertise is in handling H-1B cases. H-1Bs under President Trump got quite a bit more complicated than previously, particularly for IT positions. There are a lot of questions asked. There's a lot of material and information you have to provide. So make sure the attorney that you're consulting or you finally choose, if the company doesn't already have an attorney, and most do, make sure that they have expertise in the H-1B area because it's quite specialized these days. Okay. Who pays for what? Well, as I said before, the employer has to pay for everything. That's the bottom line. There's been a long series of judicial decisions that make it very clear that if the employee is allowed to pay, those items are considered a deduction from wages. And the Labor Department does not allow for any deduction from wages of this type. They allow for taxes and things like that, employee benefits to be deducted, but not payment for the H-1B. The employer can incur huge liabilities if they try to force you to pay. For example, an employer in Maryland was fined over $3 million for forcing employees to pay. An employer in Tennessee was fined over $1 million for forcing employees to pay some or all of these expenses. If they don't want to pay, and this sometimes comes up, they've got Americans they can hire. They don't care, if you don't pay for this yourself, they're not going to file the H-1B. Have them talk to an immigration attorney. The immigration lawyer can usually very quickly persuade them that, a little money today is much better than paying a huge amount later on. And note that the employer is not responsible for the premium yourself. Let's say you're going to a cousin's wedding or something like that. You need your H-1B approved right away. And they're also not responsible for dependents. Okay, so how does the H-1B lottery work? What are the mechanics of the lottery? It's really important that you know this because if you don't know it, you could miss the cutoff dates for the lottery. So this year, the way it works is the employer has to register with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services and name the workers that it would like to include in the H-1B lottery. This registration period is going forward March 9th and will end on March 25th. And of course, the registration period next year, if you're graduating next year, for example, will be different, okay? But it only occurs once a year, okay? It's not like you can sign up for the H-1B process any time of the year. That doesn't happen if you are in the lottery, if you're going into the lottery. And all for-profit companies, for-profit private companies, you will be in the lottery, guaranteed. Many, many nonprofits, you will also be in the lottery. Okay, I'll talk about a little bit about that in a minute. Okay, after the registration period by March 31st, USCIS says it will inform the employer which employees have been selected in the lottery, which employees have won the lottery, okay? And keep in mind that the lottery is a totally random lottery. There are two batches of petitions within the lottery. Those where the worker involved does not have a U.S. earned master's degree or higher degree. Those folks go into what we call the bachelor's cap group. And if you have a U.S. earned master's degree at the time the employer registers for you, or you will have it by the time you're to begin your H-1B employment, you go into the master's cap lottery pool. And in the master's cap, the nice thing is you get considered twice. You get considered once in the bachelor's cap and then again in the master's cap. So it increases your chances vastly of winning. Master's folks have about a 70-something% chance of winning. Folks with only a bachelor's degree have somewhere around 50%, a 50% or less chance of winning. Okay, then after the employer has USCIS has informed the employer who won, then beginning on April 1st, and we don't know what the deadline is going to be, that's to be determined, the employer has to file a complete H-1B petition packet with USCIS. And hopefully this filing occurs prior to the end of your OPT, and we'll talk about why that's important in a minute. Also, because of COVID this last year, Immigration had 2 lottery selection tranches. They announced lottery winners again in October because they did not fill all their slots because of COVID. Many employers pulled out of the process because they decided they didn't need the employees anymore because of COVID, restrictions. So I don't know if that's going to happen this coming year, but it definitely had happened last year. So don't lose all hope if you're not selected in the first go round. There might be a second go round for the lottery. Okay. So finally, you get your approval. The processing of the H1B takes 3 to 7 months or 15 days with premium processing, as I said. Once approved and after October 1st, once October 1st is passed, that's when the H1B, when you actually get the H1B status, you don't get it immediately usually. Once you're past October 1st, you can do what we call port to a new employer, okay? Porting means that your first H1B petition is approved. It's after October 1st of the date in which, or the year in which the employer applied for you. And a new employer approaches you and wants to file a new petition for you. You can move to that new employer upon filing of the new petition. You don't have to wait for that second petition to be approved, okay? So that's called porting. But note, very, very, very important to note, you absolutely cannot port prior to October 1st. If you try to port prior to October 1st, if employer 1 or employer A has an approved petition for you and you try to port to employer B, employer A will withdraw your petition right away and you will lose your place in the lottery. So very, very important that you never, ever, ever try to move employers, change employers prior to October 1st. Okay. And keep in mind that porting is difficult, very difficult, if you were not in the lottery and not counted against the quota. We're going to talk about who's exempt from the lottery and who's exempt from the quota in just a minute. But if you're going from a quota exempt employer or quota exempt position to the lottery, you could have a very difficult time porting, okay? Whoops. All right, so the cursed quota. And as I said, the quota and the attendant lottery are the worst parts of the H1B process, and they're the reason why many employers don't want to fool with H1Bs or have pulled out of the process altogether. So how many H1Bs are provided each year? About 78,200. More or less 58,200 for those with no U.S. earned master's degree, and then an extra 20,000 for those with a U.S. earned master's degree or higher degree. The reason why there's an odd number, it's not an even 85,000, which you'll often hear in the news media, which is not correct, is that 6,800 visas are set aside for citizens of Chile and Singapore pursuant to free trade agreements that we have with those countries. And that set aside gives those Chileans and Singaporeans something called an H1b visa, and that's available all year. There's no lottery for those visas. Okay, so let's look at the depressing statistics on the quota. So the last time we had H1B filings, a filing period, and there was no lottery was 2012, okay? The quotas, the 2 quotas, the master's and the regular cap were not exhausted until June of that year, and the filing period opened on April 1st. Since then, every year, the cap has been exhausted and there's been a lottery during the filing period. So last year, we had about 201 petitions filed or petitions received, and there was a lottery. If you do the math, 78,200, you can see that, it's hard to do the math with the separating out the master's and the bachelor's cap, but you can see that there were not enough visas to go around. Okay, so 78,200 folks were selected out of 201 petitions filed. So the bottom line is it's likely that there's going to be an H1B lottery for the foreseeable future. So that means that you have to stay on top of your employer every cycle, every registration cycle to make sure your name goes in, and every filing period to make sure your H1B petition gets filed promptly. Okay, very, very important to stay on top of this. Particularly if you have STEM, you're going to have up to 3 bites at the apple, as I said, with respect to the lottery. So you want your employer to file every year for you. Put your name in the registration every year because, as I said, the lottery is a lottery. If you don't file every year, your chances of winning the lottery are vastly decreased. Okay, so let's talk about now who's exempt from the lottery and who's exempt from the quota. First up, persons who have been counted against the quota within the past 6 years. So the example I like to use is you're a student, let's say you got an undergrad degree in engineering and in the US, and you got your H1b back in, let's say, 2018. But in 2019, you went back to school to do an MBA and you switched back to F1 status. Okay, so you were counted against the quota within the past 6 years because you were working for a private company as an H1b, and you won the lottery. You were counted against the lottery. You worked for a couple of years as an H1b, and then you went back to school. So you were counted against the quota within the past 6 years. You were in the lottery. You can go back to H1b status without going through the lottery again. So if this is your situation, you need to put in big, bold letters on your resume, already counted against H1b quota, not subject to lottery. Okay. Next up, persons who work in higher education are exempt from the quota, exempt from the lottery. Persons who are employees of nonprofit research and government research organizations are exempt from the lottery. And notice that I emphasize research there. Most nonprofits such as United Way, Goodwill, American Cancer Society, all those folks are subject to the lottery if they're not a research organization. Folks who work in a nonprofit with a written affiliation agreement with an institution of higher ed are not subject to the quota. This is particularly true for some K through 12 school systems. They take student teachers from places like Seattle University and train them. And because they have a written agreement with Seattle University to take those student teachers, they are not subject to the lottery. They're not subject to the quota. Then finally, we have 2 more exemptions from the quota, which are pretty esoteric, pretty weird, but I'll explain those to you. I try to explain carefully so you understand. So folks who work at rather than for a quota exempt employer, that is, they're working on the physical premises of a quota exempt employer. The typical example would be dining services at Seattle University. Those are managed, aren't they, Dale, by a private company? Is it Aramark or Sodexo or one of those?
It's Chartwell's.
Chartwell's. Okay, so Chartwell's is a private company. They would normally be subject to the quota. But if they hired you for an H1b position on the Seattle University campus, you're working for Chartwell's, you're not working for Seattle University. But because Seattle University is exempt from the quota, if you're working on the Seattle University campus for a private company, you are generally going to be exempt from the quota. Okay. Finally, persons engaged in concurrent quota exempt, quota subject jobs. That is, they're working simultaneously for a quota exempt and quota subject employers are exempt, completely exempt from the quota. Okay, the typical example would be you're a postdoc and you're on an H1b for Seattle University for Dr. Smith. You help Dr. Smith develop some product that he wants to market. He goes over to Bellevue and he sets up a private company in Bellevue, Washington. And he says, hey, you're my postdoc. You know all about this thing that I've invented. Why don't you come work for me part-time and help me gear it up for production, for marketing to the wide world. And you say, fine. You stay on at Seattle University as a postdoc on their H1b, but Dr. Smith also files an H1b for you to work for him in Bellevue. Both of those H1b petitions are exempt from the quota. You don't have to go to through the lottery to work for Dr. Smith. No problem. Okay. Capcaf Opt, very important. This is a benefit you get based on the filing of an H1b petition for you. Okay, so your OPT ends as typically most people's does on May 15th of a given year. If an H1b petition packet is filed for you prior to May 15th, prior to the end of your OPT, this is why I said earlier it's very important that petition packet get filed before the end of your OPT. If that is filed for you before the end of your OPT, you get so-called Capcaf protection. That means that you get an extension of your F1 status and an extension of your work authorization through midnight of September 30th. When you wake up on the morning of October 1st, bang, your H1B takes effect, hopefully, and you're good to go. There's no gap between the end of your OPT and your H1B starting on October 1st. Now, how do you prove that you have Capcaf authorization? Usually, normally, when an H1B petition is filed for you, Capcaf will pop up in your CVIS record, and Dale and his folks will see that automatically. Sometimes it doesn't happen, but usually it does. Dale can print out what is called a Capcaf I-20 for you and use that as proof of your work authorization with your employer. And if you're stopped by immigration, show them that I-20. Now, the little quirk, there are a couple of little quirks in Capcaf. The first quirk is if your employer files the H1B petition packet during your grace period after your OPT has ended, your 60-day grace period, then you get half a loaf Capcaf. You get permission to stay in the US, your F status is extended, but your work authorization is not extended. So you can't continue working. You have to stop working until your H1B takes effect. And for a quota subject to H1B, one that goes through the lottery, that is always October 1st. Okay, the other little quirk is you can't travel while you're on Capcaf. So this could be a lockdown period in the US, and we're all very accustomed to lockdown by now with COVID, but this could be a lockdown period where you're unable to travel for up to 6 months, okay? So that's a disadvantage, but Capcaf is a huge benefit. If you didn't have Capcaf, most employers would probably let you go, you might lose your job. So really, really important to have that Capcaf. Okay, so some of you probably have heard President Trump during his 4 years made a lot of proclamations about H1Bs. There were a lot of changes in H1B policy or attempted changes of H1B policy. So just to give you an update on what's happened since Mr. Trump lost the election. Well, there's still a pause on issuance of new H1Bs outside the US until March 31st. But this in no way affects people in the US changing status to H1B or extending H1B status. They're completely outside the pause. Also not subject to the pause are folks who are renewing their H1B visa outside the US for the same job and the same employer, and any person who was in the US as of the date of Trump's pause order, which was June 24th, 2020. If you are subject to the pause, which most of you would not be because you were in the US, most of you were probably here on June 24th, 2020. If you're subject to the pause, or if you have a friend or relative that's subject to the pause, there is something called a national interest exception for folks involved in healthcare, folks in senior management positions in companies, and also folks who are going to help the economy. All those folks can obtain what we call a national interest exception to the pause and still get their H1B outside the US. So people often ask me, can I get an H1B through my own business? Well, the long explanation is it's extremely difficult and extremely disfavored by immigration. The short answer is no, you can't. Don't try it. It's so difficult, it's not even worth trying. So your best bet, unless you have a visa alternative other than H1B, we're going to talk about those in a minute, your best bet is not to try to start an H1B through your own business, okay? So there are a few, if you don't get selected in the lottery, there are what we call workarounds, a few of these, not many, but there are a few. So the first workaround that I suggest to folks a lot is something called Day One CPT, okay? So if you miss the H1B lottery and you're still in your grace period, your F1 grace period, you can get a new I-20 for a new course of study. There are a few programs around the country that allow for day one CPT, which means you can start curricular practical training right away in your new program. A lot of these programs, I have to warn you, are very, very shady, okay? There's not much enforcement in the immigration world, so occasionally they get caught, but a lot of times they operate for years in their shadiness and nobody catches them, and you can get in trouble if you enroll at one of those universities. Two of the reputable schools that I have personally vetted their CPT programs, so I know they're good, are Harrisburg University and Ottawa University. Either one of those is going to be fine. I don't know of others. There may be others that are perfectly okay, but those are very good and perfectly fine. That's one workaround. The second workaround is something called the H3 Trainee Visa. This is for folks going into companies that have a very well-organized training program. You can be on the trainee visa for up to 2 years, but the training program cannot be primarily on-the-job training. And finally, the L1 transfer visa is another alternative, another workaround. If the employer sponsoring you has any international operations, they can transfer you out of the US, have you work for them for 1 year abroad, and then bring you back on the L1 visa, the transferee visa. Now, just a word to the wise, if you come back on an L1, the weird thing about the L1, unlike the H1B, as you know, I said you can port very easily once you're in H1B status from one employer to another. Well, the L1 does not work that way. Once you come back as an L1, you are locked to that employer. You can't leave that employer. If you do leave, you have no immigration status generally. So, and you're unable to get a job with another employer. So just be aware of that. If the employer does offer you the L1 option, make sure you try to lock them in on a guarantee of sponsoring you for a green card once you come back. Okay, other H1B alternatives. If we have any citizens of Canada or Mexico in the audience, there's a special visa for those persons called a TN visa. And this is under the new, US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, no longer known as NAFTA, but it's still known as a Treaty NAFTA visa or a TN visa. This is for specific occupations that are listed in the regulations at that citation I've given you there. It's very difficult for MBAs. If any of you is considering a TN that's an MBA candidate, these are very carefully scrutinized and there's only one job category that's available for TNs. Other alternatives, I already mentioned the H1B one for Chile and Singapore. This is not subject to the quota or not subject to the lottery, I should say. There is a quota of 6,800, but very, very seldom are all of those visas used, so you can get it any time of the year. There's also a visa for Australians called an E3. Again, very similar to the H1B, and that is not subject to the quota, so that you can get those any time of the year. Finally, I should mention that there are numerous J1 exchange visitor categories that might be available for employment. The most common one in the outside the university world is for K through 12 teachers. So this might be an alternative if you're going into the teaching realm and you can't find a school system that is exempt from the quota. The J1 might be an alternative for you. A few more alternatives. The O1, person of extraordinary ability or achievement. This requires a lot of evidence of extraordinary ability. It's probably not available to most of you unless some of you are non-traditional students. That is, by non-traditional, I mean you've had a career and you're coming back to school. Those who had a career in their home country might very well qualify for the O1, or those who are of extraordinary ability in the arts might qualify for the O1, but generally most recent graduates from higher ed don't qualify unless you're really, really extraordinary. Next up is the E1, E2, the treaty trader or treaty investor visa. If your country of nationality has a trader or investor treaty with the United States, if you want to make an individual investment of as little as $50,000 in a job creating business in the US, this can give you a visa for life and a work permit for your spouse. Or if a country or if a company that's of the same nationality as you, let's say, for example, a Japanese company, and you're Japanese, offers you a job in the US, they may be able to put you on an E1 or E2 visa. And these visas, again, are not subject to any quota. So you don't have to go through the H1b quota ridiculousness. If you want to find out whether your country of nationality has a treaty with the United States and whether you might be able to apply for an E1 or E2, go to the URL that I've got there, and that will tell you, that'll show you what the treaty country list is. Okay. And finally, I already mentioned the L1A and L1B, the transfer visas. L1A is for executives and managers. L1B is for what we call essential workers or workers with special skills. This is possible if you were employed abroad by a company for at least 1 year during the 3 years prior to coming to the US as a student. Okay, so let's say you were employed by a multinational, and usually in most audiences that I speak to, there are 1 or 2 people that are employed by multinationals before they came. That same company or subsidiary or affiliate in the US could offer you a job and get you an L1 visa. But again, the danger of the L1 is that you're locked to that company once you accept that job, and once you get into L1B status, you can't move around. The L1 can also work for entrepreneurs. If you have a company abroad and you plan on keeping that company operational, you can set up a company, affiliate, or subsidiary in the United States and possibly get an L1 visa for yourself as an entrepreneur. Also notice that for the L1, spouses can get work authorization. What if you don't get a job offer in the US? What do? You go home and cry? Do you cry in your pillow, or, you know, eat lots of junk food and watch Netflix all night? What do? Well, no, don't give up. Don't despair. There are other alternatives. Canada, Australia, and other countries have easier immigration systems than the United States. Canada right now, and I can tell you they're probably down there in Seattle at this as we speak, a lot of tech companies are recruiting for employment in Canada. We are building skyscrapers in every direction from my house here in Vancouver. There's a skyscraper going up within 2 blocks expressly dedicated to a tech company. So we have a giant tower or 2 towers going up for Amazon. We have a tower that went up for Google. We have a tower that went up for Microsoft. So they're recruiting like crazy for Canada precisely because Canada has an easier immigration system and they can get the talent they need in Canada, whereas the United States has this crazy H1B lottery system, and it's very difficult to get the talent that they need. So I would encourage you, if you're turned down in the lottery in the US, to check out Canada. Canada has a very easy system. And I've got an employer's email, an attorney's email up there, Ryan Neely. We use Ryan for a lot of work here in Canada. And I would encourage you to reach out to Ryan if you're seriously interested in immigrating to Canada. Also, don't be offended if you get what we call a home country job offer. That is a job offer in your home country where your language or cultural skills are needed. Johnson & Johnson, the big company that's just going to roll out a new single-dose vaccine in the United States next week, often hires for home country employment. And this is not a bad thing. You know, you go home to your home country, you work for a year or 2, you get really fat on your mom's home cooking, and you get transferred to Paris, or you get transferred to Melbourne. So, you know, home country employment is not a dead end. It often results in, you know, bigger things if you work hard. Okay, so I'm going to go through, let's see, where are we on time, Dale? Okay, we're 1:36. So right on time. I'm going to quickly talk about the main routes to permanent residence, and then I'm going to take your questions. How many questions do we have in the chat, Dale, at this time?
I've been trying to answer them as we go along, so there's only one that's sort of outstanding at this point.
Okay, all right. And I guess probably most of them dealt with student status so that you were answering them?
More or less, yes.
Okay, all right. Probably OPT questions, stuff like that. How do I get
yes.
OPT? Okay, all right. So there are quite a few routes to permanent residence. in the United States, but most of you are probably going to land on the employment-based route. This is where you're sponsored by an employer in most cases. A few exceptional individuals can sponsor themselves if you're of extraordinary ability or you're engaged in an activity in the US is strongly in the national interest, but 90% of employment-based immigrants are going to be sponsored by an employer. And I mentioned this in the first couple of slides where I said, this is what you should be doing. People ask me all the time, can I sponsor myself? Well, sometimes you can, but it's way better to be sponsored by an employer. If you're sponsored by an employer, your chances of getting a green card increase vastly, increase to maybe 90, 95%. Okay. If you sponsor yourself, it's all across the board. It's really hard to say. I'd have to, evaluate your case individually, but it's much more difficult to self-sponsor than it is to be sponsored by an employer. Okay, next up is family-based immigration. The relatives who can sponsor you in the US for family-based immigration are a US citizen or permanent resident spouse. And of course, these days, since 2015, this has included same-sex spouses. A US citizen or permanent resident parent can sponsor you. A US citizen child, that is someone born in the US over 21 years of age, can sponsor you. And those of you who have small children in the US, you just have to wait. That's a good retirement insurance policy. If you have a baby in the US, but he can't sponsor you or she can't sponsor you now. And a US citizen brother or sister can sponsor you. But keep in mind that in general, there are long waits to immigrate for everyone sponsored by a family member except the spouse of a US citizen, the spouse of a permanent resident, the parent of a US citizen child over 21, or the unmarried minor child of a US citizen or permanent resident. Those folks generally don't have to wait to immigrate, but everybody else has to wait a long time. For example, if you're the adult child of a US citizen, you're going to be waiting usually about 7 or 8 years. If you're the brother or sister of a US citizen, you're going to be waiting about 14 years. And if you were born in the Philippines or Mexico, you're going to be waiting over 20 years. Okay. So don't get too excited when, your sister becomes a US citizen and she lives in San Francisco. Yes, she can sponsor you, but it's, an employer can get you a green card much faster. Okay. Asylum. Folks who fear persecution in the US because of race, religion, national origin, social group, or political opinion can apply for asylum. I have to say that under Trump, the asylum process was severely damaged. It's going to be improved under Mr. Biden. He has revoked some of the changes that Mr. Trump made in the asylum process already. But nonetheless, asylum remains a very difficult process. And you need to consult, if you're considering it, you need to consult an immigration lawyer who has handled asylum cases. Quite a few asylum cases. Don't just go to any immigration lawyer because asylum is a really specialized area. Next up is a large investment. If you invest a minimum of about $1 million in either what we call a regional center, that is a pool, an investment pool, or in an individual business that you create yourself. Let's say you open a restaurant and you put $1 million into that restaurant, into infrastructure and equipment and so on. You can get a green card. Okay, this is called an EB-5 green card. Takes a while to do it. You have to maintain a lawful status while you're waiting, but it is possible. Next up is domestic abuse. If you're abused by a spouse, a partner, someone in the position of a spouse or a partner, you may qualify for a green card. If you're the victim of human trafficking or you're the victim of a serious crime committed in the US, you can qualify for a green card. If you're sponsored for a green card by a congressman or senator, this is called a private bill. You can qualify for a green card, but this is extremely rare. Only persons in severe or extreme humanitarian situations are sponsored by congresspeople. Next up, if you are placed in removal proceedings, formerly known as deportation proceedings, because the government catches you working for Domino's or catches you working for Uber, then the immigration judge can, in certain situations, stop your deportation and give you a green card, but very limited situations in which that can be done. And finally, you can apply for the diversity visa lottery every year if you or your spouse is from a low immigration country, okay? Diversity lottery gives away 50,000 green cards each year. And Dale, did you have anybody win this year? Have you heard back from any students?
I have not heard from any.
Okay. Well, 50,000 folks win every year. So I would encourage all of you to apply if you qualify. And you qualify if you're from a low immigration country or your spouse is from a low immigration country. These countries here were disqualified last year because they're all high immigration. They send us generally more than 5,000 immigrants per year. But folks from low immigration countries can qualify. I would encourage you to apply. You don't jeopardize your student status or your ability to get future student visas if you apply for the lottery. So don't worry about that. Okay, so I am done with my presentation and I am happy to take your questions. Here's my bio and here's my question page. So please hit me with your questions and you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question, or you can place it in the chat box, whichever you prefer. And Dale, I can't see the chat box, so.
Oh, okay. So there was an earlier question about the base wage that needs to be proven.
Okay.
And the question was, does it include or would it include other compensation like bonuses and stocks?
No, it does not include, it only includes the base wage. It has to be paid is only cash in hand. It does not include any fringe benefits. Okay, so there's a question here. Let's see which ones you haven't answered.
So there's the question one from a software engineer.
Yes, okay. Let me see if I can scroll down here. It's going to be very, very difficult for a software engineer to qualify for an O1. Generally, to qualify for an O1, you've got to have very significant contributions to the field as a software engineer. You'd have to have things like you invented some sort of software that's widely used around the world. And people have invited you to conferences to talk about this software and what it's, how you created it and what its utility is. So you have to have a lot of evidence. So generally for software engineers, it's not going to be possible to do an O1. You need to have an employer sponsor you for an H1b and hopefully sponsor you for a green card. And then there's another question I see after this. Can an employer file for your H1b while you're still at school? Yes, if you already have at least a bachelor's degree, or if you will achieve a bachelor's degree by the date your employer files the petition. That would be usually sometime in April or May. Okay. And
there's also a question about if an employer can sponsor you for a green card without going through H1b first.
Yes, they can. And that's possible in some instances, particularly if you have STEM OPT, that gives the employer plenty of time to sponsor you for the green card. And particularly if you're not from China or India. If you're from China or India, and even if you do have STEM OPT, that's not enough time to get a green card. China and India are subject to long waiting lists. China, generally about 3 to 4 years, India, about 10 years. So if you're from China or India and your spouse is also born in China or India, then it's not possible to skip the H1B step. Also, if you don't have the STEM OPT option, it's usually not possible to skip the H1B. Sometimes the employer can start your process very, very early. Even sometimes before you graduate, they can start preparing the paperwork and get everything done during that 1 year of OPT, but it's usually pretty difficult. You guys have a nursing school, right, Dave?
Yes, that's right, we do.
So for nurses, your process is pretty abbreviated. Unless you're from China or India, the nursing process can be done while you're on your 1 year of OPT if the employer gets started early. So for nurses, that's a good deal. For other people, it's a little bit longer, okay? And Chinese and Indians, you guys are are stuck, unfortunately. You cannot do it unless you go through the H1b process or unless there's an alternative visa available for you. Like Indian folks who become or Chinese who become Canadian citizens, you would then have the TN option. So that would be good. Okay.
So there's another question. Yeah. Oh,
okay.
I think you're reading the same one. Two people get married. It just moved. Two people get married. One gets approved for H1B and the other still on OPT. How will that work?
Well, the one on OPT needs to keep trying for the H1B. If they don't get the H1B, if they don't get selected in the H1B lottery, they can switch over to H4, which is dependent of an H1B. And H4s, once the second step of the green card process is complete, many H4s will qualify for a work permit. So that's a good thing. And Mr. Trump was trying to undo the work permit for H4s, but that never made it into the final regulations. And Mr. Biden has withdrawn that. And so H4s are totally qualified for work permits once the employer petition process is approved. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's great. It's great to hear. And you probably understand this question. I don't. Is the number shown in the level wage the bottom line?
Yes. So the number shown and the level 1 wage is the bottom line for whatever occupation you're going into for the county and state where you're going to be working. So if you are going to Houston, Texas, the county would be Harris County. You'd want to look up wages for Harris County, Texas. You wouldn't be under the San Francisco wage scales. And the wage scales vary from location to location. Obviously, wages are lower and the cost of living is lower in Texas than in San Francisco. So don't take that San Francisco example as universal. It's not. It's very high. May I apply? Do I apply for H1B if I'm graduating in May? You can, if you have an employer who's willing to offer you a job, and you will have your H1B by the time, you'll have your 4-year degree by the time the employer files that petition packet. Yes, you could apply for H1B in this cycle, but you should also apply for OPT. Don't forego your OPT possibility because it's possible the H1B won't be chosen for the lottery. It's also possible the H1B, even if it is chosen in the lottery, will not be granted. Okay, so the next question up is
there's E2 visa question.
Yeah, I see that.
Well,
if an E2 visa family member has a business in the US, can I work for them and get an H1B from them? You possibly could. All, if you're of the same nationality, you could possibly get an E2 from them as an essential employee. But it could be very difficult in either case. So I would definitely consult an immigration lawyer that has experience in that area on that question. Anybody else have a question? You're welcome. Anybody else have a question? You're welcome to either put it in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask me in person.
Hi, Dave.
I saw the question that was, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, we have someone. Go ahead.
Okay, so I asked about the O1 earlier. I just wanted to understand it a little bit better. I have like about 9 years of work experience. I've done a lot of open source work. I've published a book and I'm part of a paper publication, like try and publish a paper as well. But I don't have any example of anyone from software field who's qualified for O1. So is it at all possible?
Yes, it is possible. It is possible with that kind of background. It is possible. But what you would want to do is you can't really self-sponsor as a software engineer for an O1. Only people who are typically self-employed, like artists and musicians, can self-sponsor for O1s through an agent. You would have to have an employer sponsor you. And unless there are weird facts in your case, like you ran out of H1B time or something like that, your employer needs to try for the H1B lottery first and see what happens. And if you don't get into the lottery and you're running out of time on your OPT, then yes, you could give the O1 a shot. But the O1 would be a plan B in my book because it's much, much more difficult than the H1B if you get into the lottery.
And it comes by a private employer again, it's same employer, or do I need to be in a research organization specifically?
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
The O1 visa, right? A regular private employer can sponsor a O1, or
Yes,
is there only
absolutely.
specific kinds of companies that do that?
Any employer who needs your services, has a type of business that would have a need for your services, can sponsor you for an O1. And just the big software companies, the big IT companies, Google, Microsoft, all those folks, they all have scores of lawyers, scores of immigration lawyers who are extremely experienced in all this. And they can advise you on whether you might qualify for an O1 if you miss the H1B lottery. But I would definitely try for the H1B lottery first. Much easier, much more simple. Anybody else have a question? Okay, there's
when
one.
you apply for the green card lottery, the one that you get, what happens after that if you get it?
Once you get the green card, once you're approved for permanent residence?
Yes, the one that's lottery that happens every year.
No, that's the H1b visa. Oh, you're talking about the diversity visa lottery.
Yes.
Okay, so once you win the diversity visa lottery, it's really important that you talk to an attorney before you take any further step. And I'm not saying that to make money or anything. I'm just saying I see students make lots of mistakes once they win the lottery. For example, the first thing they want to do is they want to travel home and tell mama they won the lottery. Well, that's a terrible, terrible idea, because if you travel home and tell mama you won the lottery, when you come back, you're not eligible to apply for the green card. So you don't want to do that, okay? But you want to be very careful. If you do win, if you do get that winning notice, contact a lawyer right away, and he or she can tell you what further steps to take. Also, in some cases, you may get the winning notice, but what we call your rank number may be very, very high. If you have a high rank number, you may never actually qualify to finalize the green card. You were selected in the lottery, but your rank number is so high, they never get to your rank number. They never get that far in distributing lottery visas. So it's really, really important to consult an attorney if you do win the lottery. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, you're very welcome. So how long does it take to get a green card after being approved for an H1B? What if the employer decides to sponsor you toward the end of your H1B period? Well, your employer, it controls the process. Okay, if you're being sponsored by an employer, you have no real control over the process. You can tell your employer, I'd like to be sponsored for the green card, or I'd like you to sponsor me now, but the only thing you can do to make them do anything is to threaten to quit, okay, or threaten to move to another employer. So there's no control. You have no control over the sponsorship process. That having been said, most employers, because they know they want to keep you if you have a good skill set and a good work ethic, they will sponsor you right away once you get on the H1B. They don't wait around. Some employers, as I said before, like Microsoft or Google, will make you wait several years to sponsor you. But in any case, the employer has to file the initial papers for the sponsorship process with the government no later than the end of your 5th year. So the first application has to be filed, which is usually a labor certification. That has to be filed before the end of your 5th year. Yes, you can get the contact of Ryan. His info is in the presentation, and Dale is going to provide the presentation to everyone that was on the call today. And I think all international students, right, Dale? Is that right?
Well, I'll definitely send it to the list that we have from those that attended today.
Great, great. Okay. We've got just a few more minutes. We got 5 more minutes to answer questions. Anybody else have a question? Free immigration lawyer. You won't encounter this ever again, okay? So ask your questions while you can. No, it looks like that might be everyone, all the questions. Oh, okay, here's one more. Do you have to leave the country after being approved for H1B to re-enter with the U.S. to an H1B visa? Yes. In order to get a visa stamp in your passport, that has to be issued by a U.S. consulate abroad, but you're never required to travel after you achieve H1B status. You can stay in the U.S. for the full 6 years of H1B without traveling. The approval notice from immigration generally gives you H1B status and the right to work in the US without traveling at all. But if you need that H1B visa stamp, if you want to travel internationally while you're working as an H1B, you'll need the visa stamp, and that's only issued by a consulate abroad, US consulate abroad. Okay, does Canada count or just your home country? Canada will accept what we call third country nationals. In other words, if you're from, say, Taiwan, you can come up to Vancouver from Seattle, get your visa stamp and your passport at the US consulate in Vancouver, and go back to Seattle, and you're good to go. A lot of countries do require a visa to enter Canada, so keep that in mind. If you're from a less developed country, you will require a visa. The more developed countries don't require a visa. Mexicans do not have to have a visa to enter Canada, but a lot of countries do. So just keep in mind that there's an extra administrative step that you'll have to go through to get into Canada. Mexico, you can also go to Mexico for your visa, but only renewals. They will only renew visas in the same category. Canada will give you a new visa in a new category without a problem. Now, this all having been said, during COVID, don't try to travel. Visa appointments are very, very, very limited during COVID. H1B visas, are only granted if you're only given an appointment, I should say, if you're in certain areas like healthcare. So don't try to travel during COVID. Don't try to get a visa during COVID. But after COVID's over, go for it. Any other questions? Okay, let's see. Okay, we have two questions here. This is asked a question about the DV lottery. At what level of DV selection do you travel to your home country to get a green card interview? You never travel to your home country to get a green card interview. That's why folks need to consult an attorney. If you look at the paperwork you get from the State Department, it gives you the impression that you have to go home and get the visa. You don't have to do that. You can adjust your status in the US once your rank number is about a month away. Once you see that for the following month, your rank number is going to be there, you can adjust your status in the US. And this is why this is one very common error of folks who win the visa lottery. They think they have to go home. You don't have to go home in most cases. And will the video be available? Yes, Dale's recording it, so it will be available. And there's one other question I saw here. Is the employer-sponsored green card EB2 or EB3? This depends on the requirements for your job. If your job requires an advanced degree or a bachelor's plus 5 years experience, you'll be EB2. If your job does not require an advanced degree or does not require a bachelor's plus 5 years, you will be EB3. Okay. And I think I'm out of time. I am out of time, folks. So thank you so much for your participation today. Thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, once you get the presentation, shoot me an email. If it's a simple question, I'll answer you by email. If it's a difficult question, I'll ask you to set up a consultation. Okay? So have a great day and a great weekend, everybody. And thanks, Dale, for the invite. It was a pleasure.
Yes, and thank you, David, always.
Hopefully we'll see all of you in person next year. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Bye.